Hello, everyone, and welcome to Patriot Underground. Today is June 19th, 2021. Thank you so much for joining me to discover the truth beneath the surface. So before we get going on tonight's episode, which is part 3 of my series on Zecharia Sitchin's book, 12th Planet, I want to take a moment to thank each and every one of you for stopping by to listen and lending your consciousness to this discussion as we embark upon the Great Awakening together, as brothers and sisters bound by the love of humanity and patriotism all over the world. I continue to be inspired by the words and actions of my audience, the respect, the graciousness, the gratitude, and the honesty that people have shared with me has been truly astounding. I really never imagined I would be in this position. And now, because of you, I am. And I promise that I will do all that I can to do it justice. And I thank each and every one of you for your support. With every passing day, this journey becomes more and more fulfilling and more exciting, and I have you to thank for that. So God bless each and every one of you. Okay, so let's get into it. So the last time in part 2 of this series, we left off having discussed how and why the Nephilim created mankind, not to be confused with humanity, of course. And Sitchin describes the process which in essence was a genetic experiment intended to create a species that was intelligent enough to understand and obey commands, but one that would not rebel or really question the nature of their existence, thereby making them easy to control and easy to rule. And so what the Annunaki did was artificially inseminate the egg of an ape woman, Homo erectus, with the sperm of a male Nephilim, thereby creating mankind. So Sitchin then begins to draw similarities between the Garden of Eden tale of the fall of man and the epic of creation, specifically examining the word knowing in relation to the tree of knowledge, in order to establish that upon their creation by the Annunaki, mankind could not procreate on their own. The implication Sitchin makes is that the tale taught in the Bible is not referring to understanding as knowing, but rather referring to sexuality as knowing. That the Annunaki initially had to facilitate mankind's procreation until they modified their creation, making it possible for mankind to reproduce through intercourse. And that was the real knowing that they were referring to. So Sitchin explains that the Sumerian texts trace the conflict between good and evil to the deities Enlil and Enki, whom I've talked about before, whom he believes the Bible is referring to as God and the serpent, respectively. And this is where some of the deception of the text starts to become evident. Sitchin is seeking to vilify Enlil and exalt Enki, which is a complete inversion, as far as my understanding. In the epic of creation, Enlil was transferred the command of earth, even though Sitchin claims, quote, Enki had been the true pioneer. And we've established in our discussions with Gene that Enki was another name for Lucifer, which would make Enlil God in this context. So this originated their antagonism against one another, and by extension established the timeless struggle between good and evil. But here we see Sitchin start to show his hand, implying that Enki, or Lucifer, was the true god of earth because he created mankind along with the Annunaki. So Sitchin seeks to downplay the role of Enlil, stating, quote, while Enlil stayed at the comfortable mission control center at Nippur, Enki was sent to organize the mining operation in the lower world, end quote. And he then continues, quote, the mutiny of the Annunaki was directed at Enlil and his son, Ninurta. The god who spoke for the mutineers was Enki. It was Enki who suggested and undertook the creation of primitive workers. Enlil had to use force to obtain some of those wonderful creatures. As the Sumerian text recorded the course of human events, Enki, as a rule, emerges as mankind's protagonist, Enlil as its strict discipliner, if not outright antagonist. So there you have it. There's the inversion. And Sitchin further characterizes Enlil as a deity wanting to keep mankind sexually suppressed, and Enki as a liberating deity who bestowed upon mankind the gift of knowing, or knowledge of sexuality and procreation. But here's where we have to remember that Enki, aka Lucifer, created along with the Anunnaki, what he created along with the Anunnaki was not humanity, but mankind. So what Sitchin doesn't tell you is that humanity had already been in existence for billions of years in other solar systems. And so what the devil created was the Cabal, a hybrid species known as mankind. So it's obvious that Sitchin is exposing his belief that Enki, or Lucifer, is God, and that the Cabal rightfully rules over humanity because they have the DNA of the gods, or the Anunnaki. And I talked about this, of course, in my analysis of part 2 of my second interview with Gene, who told us that Sitchin's task was to retranslate and interpret the Sumerian scrolls to legitimize the Cabal as rulers and gods, when the reality is that it was Enki who sparked the rebellion against the authority of Enlil, just as the Bible teaches that Lucifer rebelled against God. So we can see now how this deception took root as we examine the Cabal's practice of inverting reality. They truly believe that Lucifer is the rightful God and have declared war against God's true creation, humanity. Satanists, want humans to believe that God is tyrannical and unfair and cruel, when in fact God is the opposite of all those things. God is freedom, he's equality and compassion and love and mercy. They want us to reject God for daring to have standards that he commands us to adhere to in favor of a false light that corrupts souls through deception. It's not that the Cabal don't consider themselves evil. They're consciously evil, and they know exactly what they're doing and what they've chosen. But they also know in order for them to conquer humanity, they had to do it through deception by posing as the good guy, the saviors. And isn't that exactly what the Cabal does to this day? Okay, so when we fast forward to the tale of Adam and Eve and what happened in the garden with the serpent, of course, Sitchin provides an interesting narrative. So after establishing the conflict between Enlil and Enki, whom again Sitchin casts as the victim, we're told that Enki played the role of the serpent in the garden, not as a villain, but rather as a compassionate deity seeking to liberate mankind. So Sitchin tells us that mankind was at first essentially manufactured hybrids who could not reproduce on their own, that the Anunnaki had to artificially produce an equal number of males and females. And it wasn't until Enki's intervention as the serpent in the garden that mankind became capable of reproducing on its own. Sitchin tells us that the serpent was not a lowly creature in the tale because he was able to enter the garden. He boldly called God a liar, essentially. And he had the knowledge, which was the very thing that got mankind kicked out of the garden. And that knowledge, Sitchin argues, was the knowledge of how to reproduce sexually. And according to Sitchin, Enlil, or God, was angry that the serpent, or Enki, gave mankind the ability to procreate and therefore cast them out of the garden before they would learn the secrets of immortality and become like gods. So God in this narrative is the antagonist, you see, who's holding mankind back. It's also clear that the garden is the home of the Nephilim. So once mankind was kicked out of the garden, they were essentially banished away from the Nephilim for a period of time. And this marked the beginning of mankind's independent existence in Mesopotamia, but removed from their progenitors, the Annunaki. And then we fast forward to Sitchin's story or version of the flood. And of course, it's not just his version, it has to do with the Sumerian scrolls, which we've well established. But of course, his twisting of them, as we've also well established. But if we fast forward to the story of the flood, and of course, in between, it's quite clear that when Cain is told to move eastward, the wife he takes must have been one of the Nephilim, as there were no other humans around. So not only was Cain the father of the 13 bloodlines, the mother, I assume, had to have been one of the Nephilim as well. Now, unlike Cain, the bloodline of Seth, Adam's only true son, according to my understanding, is purely human and not mankind. And it's Seth's bloodline that is the precursor to Noah, who God chose to repopulate the earth after the flood. Now, Sitchin seeks to undermine the true meaning of the Bible, so he has the reader believe that Adam was mankind and hence the first creation of the Annunaki, who he wants you to believe are God. But in truth, it was Cain, really, that was mankind's first creation by performing genetic experiments on Eve in the garden, which Gene talked a lot about. Adam was created by God, or Enlil in this version, and Enki, or Satan, was the one who defiled and defied God's creation and his intention for humanity. But of course, this book attempts to make Satan look like the hero and the victim of a cruel God who sought to keep humanity in the dark and curse the land when man became enlightened. That's how they characterize Enlil. And since we know that Sitchin was Cabal, we understand that this narrative is a deception, like all things Satan does. He poses as the savior when in fact he is the corrupter. And in this version, it's Enki that created mankind. And you're supposed to believe that, therefore, Enki is God. Now, when we fast forward to the flood, Sitchin examines the motives behind it, suggesting that the decision to wipe out mankind was actually taken from earlier Sumerian tales. And he repeatedly argues that our Bible condenses the actions and motivations of many deities into one God. And therefore, that one God often seems to contradict himself for that reason. That's his argument. And on the topic of the deluge or the flood, Sitchin explains that the original Sumerian texts tell the story of a vote held amongst the gods to determine the fate of mankind. Enlil and the other deities decided to destroy mankind for their ability to procreate and hence dilute the genetics of the Nephilim. But the narrative Sitchin offers is that Enki came to the rescue of mankind and instructed the hero of the epic of creation in this story, Utnapishtim, was just another word for Noah, that Enki instructed Utnapishtim, aka Noah, to build the ark and load it with clean animals. And initially, Enlil was angry that any of mankind had survived. And it was not until Enki made an eloquent defense of mankind that Enlil was persuaded to bless mankind's existence once again and vowed not to destroy mankind from that point forward. But Gene has pointed out on many occasions that Enki is just another name for Lucifer. So we can see quite clearly that Sitchin is praising his god as a member of the Cabal. In this narrative, Enlil, or God, is the villain who gets outmaneuvered by Enki, or Lucifer, to prevent mankind's destruction. He did this, we're told, by divulging a secret of the gods to mankind that was forbidden knowledge. The narrative also tells us that Utnapishtim, or Noah's signal to board the ark, was a rocket ship taking off, a plan that was devised by Enki. Sitchin tells us that the deluge was a global calamity unparalleled in history. However, he also suggests that it was not entirely an event that was caused by the gods, or by God, as we've been led to believe, but rather that the gods, or the Annunaki, played a passive role, as I'll explain in a moment. And Sitchin also tells us that the secret they swore to keep from mankind was knowledge of the coming flood, so that mankind would be wiped out while the Nephilim could save themselves. But it was Enki who interceded, according to Sitchin, in his translation of the Sumerian scrolls. It was Enki who interceded on behalf of his creation, mankind, to prevent their destruction, which was the will of the assembly of the deities, including Enlil. And Sitchin actually tells us that the flood was to be the final solution for humanity after several plagues failed in large part due to Enki's intercession on behalf of mankind. In other words, Enlil had been trying repeatedly to destroy mankind, and Enki kept interceding on our behalf, we're led to believe. And when the gods voted to allow the flood to destroy humanity, they knew that this flood was already coming. And Enki, at first, agreed very reluctantly. He felt bound to this decision. So again, the secret was to hide from mankind that the flood was coming, so that the Nephilim could save themselves in spacecraft, which is exactly what they did. In fact, when their spacecraft took off, that was the signal to board the ark, as I mentioned a moment ago. And they stayed in orbit above the earth until the waters began to recede, and actually wept as they looked down at the destruction of the earth, while Enki kept the secret that he had managed to save the seed of mankind. Now, Sitchin tells us that the real reason for the flood was a catastrophic ending to the Ice Age, which the Nephilim knew was coming, rather than a preconceived punishment against humanity by God. That this was essentially billions of tons of ice breaking off and slipping into the Antarctic, causing a massive tidal wave that was the Great Flood, or Deluge. And the Nephilim knew that this was going to happen upon the seventh passing of Earth from the 12th planet, as they observed the instability of the Antarctic ice sheet. They knew that this was coming, and they knew what would happen. They knew it would cause the flood. And Sitchin then provides a great amount of evidence to back this up scientifically. But I'll have to cross-reference this with Gene, of course, because, as you can probably tell, sometimes it can be difficult to discern where Sitchin is telling the truth and where he's being deliberately deceptive. Because undoubtedly, a lot of the information in this book is true, but it's the details that he twists in order to invert the protagonist of the story. At least that's my best understanding at this point. Now, in the final chapter of the book, he tells us that the flood was very traumatic to the Nephilim, and that they were actually relieved to find that mankind and animal life had not perished from the earth completely. And Enlil changed his mind because of practical matters, in large part, of returning to the planet and ensuring its inhabitability, for his people. And Sitchin also tells us that the gods decided to establish kingship after the flood on earth in order to have an intermediary with mankind. So the king would ensure that the laws of the gods would be followed. But the gods would not intermingle as they did before the flood with humanity, or mankind, I should say. And the Nephilim decided that the best approach to prevent mankind from posing a threat was to divide and rule, which of course sounds very familiar. So they established multiple different civilizations with different languages and established kings to rule over them. And in the ages that followed, Sitchin tells us that the sons of Enki and Enlil battled amongst each other for dominion over earth, instructing their kings to go to war frequently as extensions on earth of heavenly battles amongst themselves for control over mankind and other matters, of course. And with what we're learning about our so-called rulers and the fact that they are non-terrestrials at the top, people who really are in control, it seems to be pretty consistent with that. A lot of pieces to be put together, of course, but definitely a consistency as well. So then Sitchin tells us that the Nephilim established their worlds. They established the world's religions as essentially a pagan system to worship the different deities who were pulling the strings behind the scenes. That they divided Earth into 4 regions, 3 of which could be inhabited by humans, but only one of which was to be restricted for the Nephilim only, and to be guarded by heavy weaponry. And this was to be the area that they would store their spacecraft after the flood. And given all that we're learning about what exists underground, as well as in various restricted areas that nobody's ever been to or nobody's allowed to go, it definitely raises some questions in my mind as to what's going on there and with whom. So Sitchin ends the book with the elusive questions of whether the Nephilim were seen again and what their origins were on the 12th planet. So if you guys enjoyed my analysis of this book, perhaps we can get into those questions in the next series. So please let me know in the comments. Like and subscribe. Please do all that you can to support the channel. I'll be back soon with another video, God willing. Until then, God bless each and every one of you. Patriot out.